I have to assume that many of you, most of you, have watched at least one or two Bond films in your time on this chaotic Earth. For those of you who may not be familiar with the franchise, one of the key features of the spy films is the sex trope. A stunningly attractive woman uses her feminine ways to seduce a man and then steal whatever top secret knowledge he may have. I mean, that's not a trope that's isolated to the Bond films either, it's actually pretty common. And that's because it's rooted in historical examples. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at a British sex scandal from the early 1960s that involved top ministers, young attractive women, Soviet military officers, accusations of espionage, and heaps of impropriety revealed to the public in what is known as the Profumo Affair. This is the Cold War. In the spring of 1963, Britain discovered that the people running the country were not nearly as dignified, restrained, or morally upright as they had spent decades insisting they were. The revelation did not arrive through revolution, economic collapse, or war. It arrived through a sex scandal involving a cabinet minister, a young model, a Soviet naval attaché, a social climbing osteopath, and a press corps that had finally decided the old rules of deference were no longer worth following. The Profumo Affair has often been remembered as Britain's first modern political sex scandal, but that description actually undersells it. This was not simply a story about adultery. Britain's ruling class had survived adultery before. Frankly, the British establishment had treated affairs the way stately homes treat damp. Unfortunate, persistent, best ignored publicly, and just part of the way things were. What made the Profumo Affair explosive was that it collapsed several anxieties into one narrative at the exact moment post-war Britain was already beginning to feel unstable. The scandal fused Cold War espionage fears with class tensions, media sensationalism, shifting sexual politics, and growing distrust of the political establishment. By the time it ended, the affair had damaged the Conservative government, contributed to the collapse of public deference towards political elites, and exposed just how fragile Britain's post-war image of respectability really was. At the center of the scandal was John Profumo, Secretary of State for War in Harold Macmillan's Conservative government. Profumo represented exactly the kind of figure post-war Britain associated with authority. He was educated at Harrow, socially polished, and aristocratic in manner, if not title, since the Speaker of the House would not recognize his inherited title as 5th Baron Profumo of the Kingdom of Sardinia. He was deeply embedded within the political establishment and even looked like the physical embodiment of continuity and order. Unfortunately for both him and the government, he also made catastrophically poor decisions. In 1961 at Cliveden House, the estate of Viscount Astor, Profumo met Christine Keeler. Their introduction took place during one of the lavish social weekends that defined elite British society in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Keeler was young, glamorous, working class, and already circulating through a social world where wealthy aristocrats, politicians, celebrities, and nightclub culture increasingly overlapped. That overlap is important because the Profumo Affair was fundamentally about collapsing boundaries. Boundaries between private and public life, the boundaries between the ruling class and everyone else, boundaries between politics and celebrity culture, and even boundaries between national security and tabloid gossip. The figure connecting many of these worlds together was Stephen Ward, an osteopath and artist who cultivated relationships with politicians, aristocrats, actors, diplomats, and young women from London's nightclub scene. Ward occupied an unusual social position. He was welcomed into elite circles, but never fully belonged to them. He was useful, entertaining, discreet, and socially mobile in a way that fascinated upper-class Britain while also making it deeply uncomfortable. Ward also knew Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché widely suspected of intelligence work. And this is where the scandal stopped being merely embarrassing and started looking dangerous. During the height of the Cold War, Britain discovered that its Secretary of State for War had been involved with a woman who was also connected to a Soviet official. In a political climate already shaped by spy scandals and fears of communist infiltration, this was enough to trigger panic inside the British establishment. And the timing could hardly have been worse. The Berlin crisis had intensified tensions between the Soviet Union and the West. Nuclear anxiety saturated political life, and British intelligence agencies were already deeply concerned about espionage and compromise at the highest levels of government, particularly after the defections of Guy Burgess and Don McLean earlier in the decade. According to later reporting discussed by Graham Fuller, Ivanov allegedly sought information regarding the transfer of nuclear weapons to West Germany, while Stephen Ward attempted, unsuccessfully, to persuade Keeler to obtain information from Profumo. Fuller also notes the possibility that MI5 hoped to use the situation to encourage Ivanov's defection. Lord Denning would later conclude that there had been no actual breach of national security, but politically, the distinction barely mattered. Perception was enough, and the perception was disastrous. At first, the British establishment attempted to contain the situation through the old mechanisms of silence and discretion. Much of the British press still operated with an informal culture of deference toward political elites, particularly around matters of private sexual conduct. Newspapers hinted, implied, and circled the story cautiously. But the situation became impossible to suppress because another layer of chaos unfolding around Keeler's personal life. Two men connected to her, Johnny Edgecombe and Aloysius Lucky Gordon, became involved in a violent rivalry that spilled into public view through arguments, threats, and eventually a shooting incident outside Ward's London flat. Suddenly, the rumors surrounding Profumo could no longer remain safely confined to political gossip and private whispers. As Fuller notes, newspapers increasingly began making veiled references to Keeler's relationship with the War Minister, while Labour politicians pressed for answers publicly. The pressure on Profumo mounted rapidly, and in March 1963, he addressed the House of Commons directly, declaring that there had been no impropriety whatsoever in his relationship with Christine Keeler. The affair itself embarrassed the government, but the lie endangered it. British politicians had historically shown remarkable tolerance towards private hypocrisy as long as public order remained intact. Affairs could survive, embarrassment could survive, even scandal could often survive, provided an appropriate scapegoat was put forward. But misleading Parliament transformed the situation into a constitutional and political crisis. 3 months later, Profumo admitted the relationship had occurred and confessed he had lied to the House of Commons. He resigned immediately. The resignation mattered not simply because a minister had been caught in a scandal, but because the entire affair exposed the weakening authority of Britain's post-war ruling class. The Profumo affair punctured the idea that the establishment operated according to a higher moral seriousness than the rest of society. Instead, the government appeared secretive, hypocritical, and increasingly disconnected from ordinary people. Historian Frank Mort argues that scandals like Profumo should be understood as transformative metropolitan events that reshaped British moral and cultural attitudes in the post-war years. Rather than viewing the social changes of the 1960s solely through legislation or formal political reform, Mort emphasizes the importance of public scandals in destabilizing older assumptions about sexuality, class, morality, and authority. That framework helps explain why the scandal resonated so deeply. The Profumo affair touched nearly every major cultural anxiety shaping post-war Britain at once. To break it down, it involved fears about Cold War infiltration and espionage. It exposed the increasingly porous boundary between elite society and London nightlife culture. It revealed tensions around class mobility and the visibility of working-class women within aristocratic social spaces. And it unfolded through a rapidly changing media environment that was becoming less deferential, more aggressive, and more commercially driven. Mort's work is especially useful in understanding the role London itself played in these scandals. He argues that post-war metropolitan scandals repeatedly highlighted the collision of high and low cultures within the city, linking elite politics to transgressive sexuality and public spectacle. The Profumo affair embodied exactly that collision. Aristocrats, ministers, Soviet diplomats, nightclub dancers, tabloids, and criminal courts all became entangled within the same public narrative, and no figure embodied the uglier dynamics of that narrative more than Stephen Ward. As the scandal intensified, Ward became the establishment's ideal scapegoat. The same elite circles that had once welcomed him now treated him as expendable. He was prosecuted on charges related to living off the immoral earnings of prostitution, while newspapers depicted him as a corrupt manipulator and sexual predator. Fuller describes this process bluntly, arguing that the establishment, quote, closed ranks and sought a whipping boy. Historically, it's difficult not to see Ward in precisely those terms, because the wider scandal revealed a culture in which elite male sexual behavior was common, quietly tolerated, and often protected. Yet Ward, who existed awkwardly between classes and lacked the institutional protections available to ministers and aristocrats, absorbed much of the public fury. During his trial, physically and emotionally exhausted, Ward overdosed on sleeping pills. He died before the verdict was formally delivered. His death remains one of the darkest elements of the affair because it exposed the asymmetry at the heart of British scandal culture. The powerful often survived, the socially vulnerable rarely did. The treatment of Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies, another of Ward's young women caught up in the affair, also revealed how deeply gendered the scandal was. Both women became objects of national fascination and public condemnation simultaneously. The tabloids sexualized them relentlessly while portraying them as symbols of moral decline. Their visibility made them culturally useful and socially disposable at the same time. What's striking is how long these dynamics endured. Fuller's discussion of the 1989 film Scandal demonstrates that the same patterns still shape British media decades later. The press attempted to market the film through sexual sensationalism while continuing to frame the women involved through a lens of ridicule and moral judgment. Fuller describes this as the enduring logic of prurience and outrage that defined British tabloid culture around the scandal. The public was encouraged to consume the scandal while simultaneously pretending to be horrified by it. That contradiction sat at the center of the entire affair. The Profumo scandal also unfolded against the backdrop of Britain's declining imperial power. The country was still grappling with the humiliation of the Suez Crisis and adjusting to its diminished status within global politics. The old language of British stability and authority already felt increasingly fragile by the early 1960s. In that context, the scandal seemed symbolic of broader national decline. Britain's governing elite no longer appeared disciplined or competent. Instead, they appeared theatrical, compromised, and strangely incapable of controlling the systems they supposedly governed. Keep in mind, it wasn't that the people running the country weren't actually any less capable than those in power before them. It was just that their failings, moral or otherwise, were being put on public display for the first time. The political consequences were significant. Harold Macmillan's government suffered severe reputational damage, and Macmillan himself resigned later in 1963, officially due to ill health. In 1964, the Conservatives lost power. The Profumo Affair did not single-handedly destroy the Conservative government, but it crystallized public distrust in a way that permanently altered British political culture. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal accelerated the collapse of deference. For generations, Britain's political and social systems had depended on an implicit agreement that the ruling class would remain insulated from intense public scrutiny. The Profumo Affair shattered that insulation. The press became more aggressive and the public became more cynical. Political scandal increasingly became part of mass entertainment culture. In many ways, the affair feels strikingly modern now. A political elite insulated by privilege, media systems driven by outrage and spectacle, national security rhetoric fused with celebrity scandal, women simultaneously sexualized and condemned in public discourse, institutions insisting everything remained under control while visibly failing to maintain authority. While technology has changed enormously since 1963, human behavior certainly has not. And that may be the reason the Profumo Affair continues to fascinate historians and audiences alike. It was never simply one minister having an affair. It was about Britain confronting the reality that its post-war establishment no longer possessed the moral authority, secrecy, or cultural control it once depended upon. Once the facade cracked, it became impossible not to notice how unstable the entire structure already was. Writing this here in the middle of 2026, it's hard not to be struck by the striking parallels between the Profumo Affair of the early 1960s and the deep scandal surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, a man working to cross social boundaries, catering to the desires of the rich and powerful, and when caught out, offered as the sacrificial lamb at the altar of at least moral impropriety, while those consuming the service provided continue in their positions of power and privilege. We can even speculate if Ward's death was truly accidental, the same way that so many people regard Epstein's death as highly suspicious. Either way, both deaths were certainly convenient for those who stood to possibly lose it all. At the end of the day, further grist for those who argue that while history may not repeat, it sure does rhyme. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which really just wants truth and justice to win out. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of grey and rarely black and white.